So this is my first screencast. It is titled The American Evolution of Race from the 17th to the 21st Century. So the first thing I'm going to address is race as a social construct as opposed to a matter of biology. Recognizing race as a social construction is something that has occurred throughout American history but has not prevented discrimination of individuals based on their ethnic heritage or physical attributes. Race has historically been a deeply politicized matter. Our perception of a person's race is colored by our beliefs about what constitutes a particular ethnicity. As a society, we develop cultural rules about race, and then we apply these rules when psychologically categorizing people. Collectively, it has been economically convenient to deny basic rights to enslaved African Americans or the indigenous population who stood in the way of American expansionist projects. Usually, the moral justification from the slave-owning classes has come from a position of believing oneself superior to the enslaved. Because if that was not the case, the ostensibly natural state of things would have to be different. The dismantling of the institution of slavery went a long way in disillusioning many to what was an implicit social acceptance that racial differences are equivalent to intellectual differences. And that was based on the reading of Hodson. So, the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 17th century, Thomas Morton, an Englishman who had settled in the New World, conceived of race among the indigenous population not as a fixed biological concept, but as a mutable characteristic. He observed them as being born of a complexion white as our nation, but they have stained their skin forever by bathing in walnut leaves. This conception of race toward the indigenous population differed from the set of laws that were quickly established to set up racial barriers between Europeans and Africans who had been taken to the New World as slaves. Captain Thomas Phillips, master of a slave ship, reinforced Morton's outlook on the nature of race. I can't think there is any intrinsic value in one color more than another, nor that white is better than black, only we think it so because we are so. So continuing on to the latter part of the 17th and 18th centuries. Despite the relative progressiveness of Captain Phillips' social constructionist views on race, this did not prevent him from exploiting the Atlantic slave trade for personal enrichment. So in this image you can see the Atlantic slave trade and Africans being exported to the New World and to the West Indies, into Barbados, to labor. Many sent to Cuba. So the booming tobacco and cotton businesses enabled the legally sanctioned oppression and genocide of Africans and the indigenous population to expand. By 1705, Virginia planters used the law to maximize the profitability of their slaves and closely regulate every aspect of their daily lives. So, the 19th century. In the early part of the 19th century, a policy known as Manifest Destiny, which officially and unofficially authorized the displacement of Native Americans west of the Mississippi River, depended on a belief rooted in the racially charged notion that white Americans could best use new lands and opportunities. Assimilation became undesirable for the federal government when they recognized the valuable farmland that the Indians occupied, so they planned instead for forced removal. It was suggested by President Andrew Jackson that removing Indians from contact with whites, that they might cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community. Here again we see a desire on the part of Americans to culturally reform the Indians while making racist arguments to justify their expulsion from the territory that they had previously occupied. So continuing on with the 19th century, on the right-hand side we can see the Native Americans that the school founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School attempted to assimilate. So the belief that it was necessary to assimilate the Native American population reemerged during the latter part of the 19th century. The notion that their race could be redefined by changing their clothing and cutting their hair can be seen in the Carlisle Indian Industrial School photographs. The school founder once stated, "All the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." This same form of assimilation was not offered to the emancipated slaves during the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, where African Americans were granted legal freedom but little else. South Carolina and Mississippi passed laws known as black codes to regulate black behavior and impose social and economic control. African Americans were still widely regarded as fixed biologically, inferior intellectually, and dependent on white men in order to survive. So the 20th and 21st centuries. On the right-hand side, we can see photographs of the Little Rock Rally. Racial segregation over education was a battleground topic that came to a head in 1962 when riots broke out after James Meredith became the first African American to enroll at the University of Mississippi. So racial desegregation was a gigantic deal in the South because, it had been so deeply entrenched and institutionalized in the culture that, this was unthinkable. And the civil rights movement happened pretty rapidly. It was kind of a culture shock. This tradition of considering race to be a fixed concept continued into the 20th century, as can be seen in photographs of the Little Rock Rally. This controversy revolved around the Little Rock Nine, a group of young African American students who had just been admitted to Central High School. Race mixing was equated with communism, both of which at the time were considered to be threats to the American way of life. And so this is the last slide, and it just takes us into the the middle part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st centuries. Through the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, African Americans have earned greater social and political equality. Despite Jim Crow laws being held unconstitutional and desegregation has been initiated, the after-effects of centuries of discrimination remain a reality for African Americans. In the 21st century, the first African American has been elected and re-elected President of the United States. These are signs that significant progress has been made toward racial equality, since the institution of slavery was commonplace during the 17th century. On the other hand, mass incarceration, police brutality, and the war on drugs serve as affirmations that the spirit of the Jim Crow laws, and racism in general, is very much still alive in America today. And these are my sources. Thank you for listening in. I look forward to my next screencast.